A joint news conference on the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter program. And now, from Minneapolis, the life of Hubert Humphrey is profiled in the C-SPAN series, The Contenders.
Stay right there. Stay right there. You're nuts. Stay right there. Stay right there. You're nuts. Stay right there. Stay right there. You're nuts.
Mr. Chairman, my fellow Americans, my fellow Democrats, I proudly accept the nomination of our party This moment is one of personal pride and gratification, yet one cannot help but reflect the deep sadness that we feel over the troubles and the violence which have erupted regrettably and tragically in the streets of this great city, and for the personal injuries which have occurred.
That's Hubert Humphrey accepting the 1968 Democratic nomination for president at Chicago's Conrad Hilton Hotel, where the Democrats had gathered for their convention in the midst of the Vietnam War, while thousands of angry protesters demonstrated outside. Hubert Humphrey, longtime Minnesota senator and unsuccessful candidate for president in 1968, is the focus of this week's Contenders program. And we're live from Minnesota's History Center. Mick Coet is the documentarian of Hubert Humphrey's life, just finished a documentary last year. We're standing in the middle of an exhibit that the History Center has put on about the tumultuous year of 1968. So to start our discussion about Hubert Humphrey, I want you to set the stage for people. As 68 dawned, this country was in an uproar about the Vietnam War. Set the stage.
Well, the Vietnam War had been running for a long time at that point, probably 15 years. And the Tet Offensive at the end of January really set the stage for the year, because it was obvious to everyone then that the war was not being won. And the North Vietnamese reached all the way to the American embassy in Saigon. President Johnson's approval ratings just plummeted. And McCarthy had been in the race in the fall. Bobby Kennedy was joining the race. And it was just utter chaos at that point. And then, of course, right after President Johnson resigned in the 29th of March, 3 days later, Martin Luther King was assassinated. So the beginning of that first part of the year was a terrible chaos.
It was a year when people who were alive were turning on their radios every morning to wake up, and there seemed to be another huge story every day. We're going to try and tell some of that story in the context of Hubert Humphrey's campaign for president. We'll be here for 2 hours, and as we're here, we'll learn more about the history of the times and the biography of Senator Humphrey. And partway into it, we'll begin taking your telephone calls so you can be part of our discussion here. What's important for young people to understand is that what's different about the wars we fight today and the Vietnam War is the draft. So this was real, in a sense, for American families in a very different way than the professional army we have today. Will you talk about that?
Sure. The draft was really the point at which the protest really started, when the draft was instituted, and it really now people have a choice if people want to enter the military, or if they're against the war, they can stay away. In those days, there was no choice. You either went to Canada or you did something to get out of being drafted, and that's really what caused the protest. Because, and the other part of that is that people weren't even able to vote until they were 21, but they were being drafted at 18, so they couldn't even vote the people out of office that were running the war. So that's probably the biggest difference.
So is it fair to say that every American family had a personal connection to this war in one way or the other?
I would say pretty much, and some had, two. They had someone who went to the war and someone who was against it in the same family. In fact, Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, his own kids were against the war, and he had kids stay, anti-war protesters, stay at his house. Stay at his house during that. So there was, families were broken over it, much like the Civil War, I guess.
The other thing that people should understand that made this real in a way that hadn't in wars fought earlier was television. Mm-hmm. Television was bringing it into people's living rooms every night. Will you talk about the effect of that?
Well, it was wide open because nobody had really done any kind of television wasn't restricted. It was all brand new, and so nobody in the administration or anyone else had any control over it. So the journalists were just going out there and getting whatever they found, and we don't have that now. It's much more controlled in the battlefield. So we were seeing things in the living room that you wouldn't see now. Actual battle scenes and people being wounded and that kind of thing. And it had a profound effect on the country. And there was another reason why people came out against the war was they started seeing it all the time on TV. And 300 body bags were coming back every week at one point, and they were showing the body bags coming back and the caskets, and it just had a profound effect. It changed the average person's mind.
Now we have to remind people that the war started before Lyndon Johnson's term. You said it had been raging for 15 years,
right.
Earlier with advisors and later as troops were deployed. So Lyndon Johnson's attitude about the war was what?
Well, I think he was confused about it for a long time, but he did not want to lose it. It was really important to him to win the war, and it colored everything he did. People tried to talk about any kind of a settlement, and he wouldn't do it. He was interested in winning the war. That was his. And once he got into it, he didn't have a lot of options, and that was the one that the only one he wanted. He had no other option. He didn't want to, and that affected when he left office too. He wanted someone to come into office that would continue his war policy and wouldn't end the war and make him a loser, basically.
So Lyndon Johnson and Hubert Humphrey became teammates in 1964, following the assassination of Kennedy, when Lyndon Johnson ran in his own right. What was the relationship like, and how was this period for Senator Humphrey?
Well, the intensity in Vietnam started almost at the exact same time that he became vice president. The Tonkin Gulf resolution, the Tonkin Gulf incident in the summer in Vietnam of '64, there was a resolution in Congress that LBJ asked for, and it was passed, and Humphrey signed onto that. He wasn't yet vice president, as did Gene McCarthy and others. And then the convention came later in the summer, and Humphrey became vice president. So he walked into the beginning of Johnson's real involvement with the war. Campaigned all during the fall, and they really never talked about Vietnam in the campaign. The campaign was more about Barry Goldwater being trigger happy, and being Humphrey and Johnson were the peace candidates, and Goldwater was the war candidate, basically. And so, but Vietnam really wasn't talked about. They were talking more about nuclear.
In '64.
In '64, yeah, they were talking more about nuclear, annihilation and nuclear war. And so they won by a landslide, 44 of 50 states. And so in the spring, in the early part of the year when they were in office, there was another incident in Pleiku in Vietnam, and Johnson called a cabinet, sort of an ad hoc cabinet and advisor meeting, and he had already decided to bomb North Vietnam in retaliation. And he asked people around the table what they thought of this, and everyone pretty much agreed. But Humphrey said it's not a good idea, and he backed off. And he had written Johnson a memo earlier, before he was vice president, saying we should not get involved, shouldn't send ground troops in, shouldn't bomb. This is not a good idea, both for you politically, for the country. People won't understand it. So he spoke up again at this meeting. Johnson got angry. Humphrey went back and wrote another memo, a long, detailed one, and sent it to him. And at that point, he was completely frozen out of any discussion of Vietnam.
Well, we have our first two video clips in the program to show you. First is 1964. And remember that Lyndon Johnson had been operating without a vice president when he came into office after the Kennedy assassination. So there was a great deal of speculation going into the convention about who his choice would be to run in 1964. Here is a film from the '64 convention as Lyndon Johnson announces his choice for vice president.
As the next vice president of the United States, my close, my long time, my trusted colleague, Senator Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota.
Democrats and most Republicans in the Senate voted for education legislation, but not Senator Goldwater. Most Democrats and most Republicans in the Senate voted to help the United Nations in its peacekeeping functions when it was in financial difficulty, but not Senator Goldwater.
I couldn't help but think at that particular moment how far we'd come, all of the hard work and effort that we'd put in through those many years. This was a great moment in my life.
Mr. Johnson said in his judgment, Mr. Humphrey was the best man to be president in case anything happened to him. No longer is the vice presidency just another job.
Well, that video, we should tell you, and much of the video you're going to see tonight is from Mick Coet's documentary on Hubert Humphrey, The Art of the Possible. I want to thank you for letting us show it to our audience tonight. Lots to follow up there. First of all, the scenes of the energetic Hubert Humphrey addressing the crowd and having the crowd eating out of his hands, and then the cutaway to Lyndon Johnson, who just didn't seem to share the moment. What was happening there?
Well, he didn't like obviously didn't like the spotlight being taken from him, and Humphrey generally believed to be a better public speaker, so he was just a little bit upset about Humphrey taking the show away, I think. But you know, he was that way. That was Lyndon Johnson. That, by the way, the Goldwater, not Senator Goldwater part of that speech, it was written by a number of people. That speech was written by Bill Moyers. He wrote that back and forth, and there was a call and response kind of thing that really kind of caught on. That was an early one of that kind of speech and worked really well.
The call and response.
Yeah. Yeah, not Senator Goldwater, and then they would,
right.
You know, there was crowd would respond.
It was also Senator Humphrey had ambitions for the presidency for quite a while. He toyed with it in '52, made a real bid in '60, and here he was finally at that convention accepting the vice presidential nomination. You could see how excited he was about the moment. He earned the nickname the Happy Warrior. He loved politics, right? Right.
Oh, absolutely. He loved politics, and he got in trouble later for calling it the politics of joy, which is what he was about. He was joyful about politics, and he believed it was a way to do better in the country, to change the country, and he believed in it in a very innocent and we might think naive way, but it was really an innocent way. He believed in the country, believed in the American people, believed in one at a time and all American people at once. He really believed in our system, and so that was a way for him to change the country if he could.
Well, another clip, and this is later on in 1974 when Hubert Humphrey was gathering material for his memoir and made audio tapes, and we're going to use some of those throughout the program. But he talks a bit, and this is just one example of the relationship that you referenced and how it really became very testy between Lyndon Johnson and Hubert Humphrey as the administration wore on over Vietnam. And he reflects on some of the ways that Lyndon Johnson used the powers of the office, the perks of the office, to keep his vice president under control. Let's listen.
Well, there wasn't a time that I ever got a plane that I didn't have to ask for. And believe me, if anybody would ever tell you that Johnson was extravagant, it surely wasn't with his vice president. Many times he would say to me,
that it was better to take a smaller plane. He said, if you have a plane that's too big, there'll be too many people want to ride with you. You'll be encumbered with too many people who see that there's an extra seat that hasn't been used. And so from time to time on short trips, particularly up and down the Atlantic seaboard, I would take a King Air, a Beechcraft King Air or Queen Air, one of the smaller planes that was available, or a two-engine Convair that was a military plane. For our longer trips, we used the Jetstar. Never within the continental limits of the United States did we ever use Air Force 1 or 2, that is, the four-engine jets. Those were reserved only, those were to be used by me only for overseas trips. And at no time was I ever permitted to bring a newspaper man or a person of the media, radio, television, or press, with me on any trip within the United States. The President forbid it, and of course I respected his command and his wish. I gather he felt that that the Vice President should be heard and seen, but not reported upon too much.
Of course, Lyndon Johnson had been the majority leader in the Senate when Hubert Humphrey had been serving there. These two men had a long relationship and served in leadership together. Could you talk more about how Johnson used the levers of power to control Hubert Humphrey?
Well, as I was saying earlier, when he had this argument with Johnson about Vietnam, Johnson shut him out, froze him out at that point for at least a year about any talk about Vietnam or any foreign policy, basically. He cut off his privileges, he shortened his staff. At one point he tapped his phones, and he did a number of things to basically control Humphrey. And he didn't want him speaking out against Vietnam, didn't want him speaking out about anything that Johnson might have, didn't want him to speak about, basically. He wanted to keep him quiet. And he had a way of calling them my planes, my boats, and Johnson did this sort of possessive, kind of attitude about these, as if they were his and not the American people's. So he was very much in control of that, and Humphrey dealt with it a lot. There were times when he gave 3 or 4 speeches in 1 week, and he had to call and get permission for each plane for each speech for that week. So it was worse during that period, and that freeze lasted about a year, and then Johnson sent him to Vietnam.
Did Hubert Humphrey talk about how he reacted to this? He had to have been unhappy.
He was miserable for a long time during this freeze in particular, because Johnson was basically shutting him out of any of the inner circle, of his inner circle. So he was kind of on the outside, and he wasn't happy during that time because he wanted to be involved in what was going on. It was a bad time for him. But then he went back. He was sent to Vietnam a year later, and things changed in 1966.
We are going to walk around this exhibit tonight and give you some sense of the exhibit that's been put together here, showing the year 1968 with the focus on politics and our stops. And I wanted to remind you about your participation. In about 10-12 minutes, we're going to start taking telephone calls. Here's how you can do it. If you live in the Eastern or Central time zones, our number 202-737-0001. If you live in the Mountain or Pacific time zones, our number is 202-737-0002. And we really look forward to your comments on 1968, tumultuous year in American history, and the year in which Hubert Humphrey was a contender for President of the United States. Why don't you walk along with me, and we'll go to our next stop here. So how'd you first get interested in Hubert Humphrey?
Well, I grew up here, so he was always in the air when I was a kid. And I spent some time working here and saw his archive. And the archive was just fabulous. And for a documentary filmmaker, that's, of course, gold mine.
The Humphreys had 4 children. Are the children still here, and are they active in politics?
His daughter is no longer alive. She died a couple years ago. His grandson Buck is more more involved in politics than the others. The sons are basically in sales, all of them. And Hubert, his Skip, Hubert III, his son, works for an advertising agency, I believe. So none of them are really in politics at this point.
Well, we are at the exhibit about the politics, the political life of Hubert Humphrey, which really was his life, but he wasn't born in Minnesota.
No.
Where was he born?
Born in Dolan, South Dakota, and it was about 90 miles from the Minnesota border into South Dakota, in one of those little railroad towns that dotted the South Dakota prairie, that went along the prairie. And he was born in 1911, and it was a remarkable little town. Sort of an intellectual ferment going on there. His father was a druggist. His mother was a Methodist, sort of a social gospel person. So he got the politics in his father's drugstore and her social Methodist, social gospel kind of feel. So he got it from both sides, and sort of, as Bill Moyers calls him, the great combination of the preacher and the politician. He got both sides.
He went to pharmacy school himself, so how did he end up in politics?
He went to pharmacy school largely for a job he always really wanted to be in politics. He did it in a short time to help his father with the drugstore. But I don't think he ever really wanted to be a pharmacist for life.
He ended up getting a doctorate, as I understand, in political
No, he
science?
didn't. Nope, he got a master's degree.
Master's degree?
Yeah, at LSU.
And what were his intentions? Why was he studying politics?
Well, initially he was going to get a doctorate. He was going to come back to the University of Minnesota, get a doctorate, and teach. That was his first idea. And then he was so good at public speaking and he was so good at communicating that a lot of people around him convinced him to run. And I guess deep down he probably really did want to run. So he ended up coming back to Minnesota and becoming mayor of Minneapolis. That's where he first started.
And when did he serve as mayor? And what was the city like then? Do you know?
Well, he came back from LSU, from the South, from grad school in 1940. And Minnesota had been a Republican state, and they'd never elected a Democrat to the Senate. And the reason why was because the non-Republicans were divided between the Democrats and the Farmer Labor Party. He helped to unite those two parties into the Democrat Farmer Labor Party and built himself his own political base. And then that's how and the city was corrupt and bigoted and all kinds of problems with segregation and things. And when he first came, Nation magazine called it the capital of anti-Semitism in the United States. And when he left, he got an award from the National Council of Christian and Jews for the things he did.
Talk a little bit about the DFL. Is it still active in Minnesota politics today? And Hubert Humphrey was really its founder.
Well, he was one of 2 or 3 people, but he was probably the greatest negotiator of the group.
And what does it stand for?
Democrat Farmer Labor Party.
But from an ideology standpoint, how does it distinguish itself from the Democratic Party as a whole?
Well, I don't know that it does anymore, but at the time, it was a group of farmers and laborers, obviously, who had probably differences. Well, it's a complicated story, but they probably had differences with the more professional sort of Democrats that were, the FDR Democrats. It was a split there, and they just didn't like each other. And Humphrey was one of the people that finally, convinced them that they're never going to win an election unless they get together. And the Democrat Farmer Labor Party at one point, I believe, had 1/3 of our legislature.
He ran for Senate when?
He ran for Senate in 1948 after the speech.
Successfully, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that speech. But I have a clip, not from them, but from 1960 when he first seriously thought about running for president. And this is just one of those joy of being a politician of Hubert Humphrey. Let's watch.
How do you think your race is going?
Well, like this roller coaster, it's been an uphill fight, but I think we've been doing quite well.
Now, would you mind telling me what has been the most exciting part of the campaign so far?
I just had it.
Thank you, Senator.
Well, I tell you, this is good fun.
Thank you, sir.
And politics ought to be fun.
Yes, sir.
So vote for Hubert. Hubert Humphrey, the president for you and me.
And there we see Hubert Humphrey just enjoying life. Did he bring this to his politics all the time?
All the time, yep. That was pretty much the way he ran. And he would light up a room. I mean, people that had met him would say that it would be 11 o'clock at night and he would get off the plane and work till 3 in the morning and everybody was asleep and he'd still be like that. He could just do it, he could just run like that constantly. And he loved what he was doing.
And what were some of his other characteristics? I've read that he was known for talking a lot, for example.
Absolutely. But he was also a good listener. And people miss that part. He did talk a lot. In his speeches, he would come with a prepared speech and put it down and just talk for an hour. He knew a lot about a lot of different subjects. Really intelligent, an astounding memory. They figured that at the time that he maybe knew 5,000 to 10,000 people by first name.
What a politician's gift
really
to be able to remember names.
He could go to a
like
town,
that.
meet somebody, go back 5 years later, remember their name, their family's name, what they did for a living. I mean, remarkable memory.
Well, we're going to start taking some calls, and then we're going to learn a little bit more about his political philosophy and how he developed it. First up is Kurt in Copley, Ohio. Kurt, welcome to our conversation about Hubert Humphrey.
Well, thank you, and good evening, Ms. Swain, and it's a wonderful program to be participating in.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And you mentioned 1948, and I remember hearing, and I've watch some of the clips on YouTube and on the internet of an actor named Ronald Reagan who endorsed Hubert Humphrey in 1948 for the U.S. Senate, which were they, I mean, when you think about it, were they kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, even though they were both Democrats at that time? But also, I wanted to find out what Hubert Humphrey's relationship was with Barry Goldwater in the U.S. Senate versus what their private life was like. And also, did Hubert Humphrey and Jack Kennedy get along very well when they were running against each other for president in 1960 and in 1956 when they actually vied for the vice presidential nomination to run with Governor Adlai Stevenson, who ultimately they lost to Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee.
Right. Thank you so much, Kurt. Well, we're going to take those in order. First, his relationship with Ronald Reagan.
He was a lifelong friend of Ronald Reagan's, and Ronald Reagan was pretty much the same politics back in those days. He was the head of the Actors Union, the Actors Guild. He was a Democrat, and he pretty much had the same philosophy as Humphrey. Ronald Reagan changed. Humphrey remained the same. But they did remain friends all those years, and a great respect for each other.
Barry Goldwater.
Barry Goldwater and Hubert Humphrey were even better friends. They were absolutely, the best story I've heard about their friendship was they were giving speeches in Iowa on the back of a hay wagon out on a farm. They just ripped each other apart in these back-to-back speeches, and someone drove through town later in the day and saw them having dinner together. So they were good friends.
This, if you could talk in general, Kennedy is next, but before we talk about Kennedy specifically, about the United States Senate, these are the times of very big names of the senators. People recognize the names from history books even today. And was there bipartisanship? Did people work across the aisle? Talk about what the Senate was like.
Absolutely. It was disagree without being disagreeable. That was really what was going on. There was a lot of camaraderie. Humphrey was friends with a lot of Republicans. He was friends with even some of the Dixiecrats who he differed with. He was friends with some of those people, and it was a different in that it was more cordial, and I believe there was more camaraderie than there is now. But I'm not in the Senate now, but I can tell you that they were pretty close. Those people, they worked closely together.
JFK and their relationship.
JFK's relationship through the early years in the Senate, Humphrey, they voted together on many of the same bills. Humphrey helped him with farm legislation because he knew nothing about it. The relationship changed dramatically in 1960 during the election and during the primaries and then the election.
In what ways?
Well, they fought, they had these debates in the election, in the primaries in Wisconsin and West Virginia. And they got to know each other that way. And then when Kennedy became president, Humphrey gave him many of his ideas to use in his administration. And the Washington Post had called Humphrey the idea factory for the Kennedy administration because he had so many of the ideas. The Peace Corps, for instance, is one of
Humphrey's idea, the Peace Corps.
Oh, yeah.
Let's take a call next from Indianapolis. This caller's name is Jerry, and you're on the air, Jerry. Welcome.
How you doing, ma'am? Sir, I love your show. But I got a question for the man. Back in 1968 and 1948, was Humphrey spending more time with on the civil rights movement with Dr. Martin Luther King and Kennedy and Humphrey and Lyndon B. Johnson?
Yes, and we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about his civil rights. In fact, why don't we get into that part on his worldview by showing a clip. This is from your film, The Art of the Possible. This is early in his career, which Hubert Humphrey talks about his view of the world and his brand of liberalism. Let's listen. All right, we don't have that clip as we're getting it ready. Why don't you help us understand what informed his politics?
Well, to answer the question too, the civil rights was long. It was in him from the time he was born, so it wasn't new to Hubert Humphrey. Lyndon Johnson was in a southern state and had to deal more with the whole idea of the issue of race and getting elected, so it was quite different for him. But Humphrey felt and believed deeply what he was up against, and what he actually did in that speech Lyndon Johnson called the most courageous political act in the 20th century, because he could have destroyed the Democratic Party, could have destroyed Truman and his own career. So he really believed in civil and human rights.
And as I understand that caller, he was asking about Humphrey's commitment compared to the other two. So really, to Lyndon Johnson and to John Kennedy.
Yeah.
Can you make a value judgment about how much they cared about the issue compared to Hubert Humphrey?
Kennedy was, Johnson probably was more in line with Humphrey. Kennedy was a reluctant civil rights person. He came to it later, and Bobby came to it even more. But it was an issue for Humphrey from the beginning, and it was an issue for Johnson, actually, for many years, too. Humphrey was much more passionate about it, I believe, and much more involved with the African-American community. He spoke at NAACP meetings, and he knew a lot of people. He didn't know Martin Luther King, of course, in '48 that early, but he did know a lot of other labor leaders, E. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin and other people who were around at that time. Yeah, so.
Let's listen to Cynthia in Sioux City, Iowa. Hi,
Good
Cynthia.
evening. I was a member of the television news team in Sioux City, Iowa, but I happened to be in Washington, D.C. reporting the day we withdrew from Vietnam, and I had the privilege of interviewing Hubert Humphrey on that very day. And he spoke about, I asked him how he felt about losing the Vietnam War, and he said he too was a casualty of the Vietnam War. He was quite emotional and had a tear in his eye. I wonder if you could talk more about his Vietnam policy.
Well, the two trips he made to Vietnam while he was vice president changed. The first trip was scheduled for him, and he went to a prescribed trip with all the stops planned for him, and he was watched pretty closely. And he saw only the good side of the war, spoke to the good generals, heard all the good news about the war. The second time, he decided to go on his own a year later. He went out on his own, went to hospitals, talked to people, and at that point, he quit cheerleading the war because he found out about the corruption in the South Vietnamese government and all of the other things that were going on with the war, and he realized it was lost. And he came back from the second trip in late 1967 knowing that the war needed to be over. But he was boxed in. He'd been speaking out for the war for the last year, the year previous, and Lyndon Johnson was not going to let him speak against the war, so he had himself in a bad situation. And that conflict lasted with him all the way through 1968.
So as the caller before alluded, the two great issues of Hubert Humphrey's political career were civil rights and the Vietnam War. And that 1948 speech that the caller talked about really launched Hubert Humphrey onto the national stage. We're going to listen to a clip from that speech to the convention in Philadelphia in 1948. And when we come back, we're going to be joined by another guest who will be with us for the program. Juan Williams, Fox commentator, but also the author of a number of books that deal with the civil rights era in American history. To the 1948 clip now.
Mr. Chairman, fellow Democrats, fellow Americans, I realize that in speaking in behalf of the Minority Report on Civil Rights, that I'm dealing with a charged issue, with an issue which has been confused by emotionalism on all sides of the fence. I feel I must rise at this time to support the Minority Report, a report that spells out our democracy, a report that the people of this country can and will understand, and a report that they will enthusiastically acclaim on the great issue of civil rights. To those who say that we are rushing this issue of civil rights, I say to them, we are 172 years late.
After all, I had been the destroyer of the Democratic Party, the enemy of the South. Hubert Humphrey, the quote-unquote nigger lover. But I never felt so lonesome and so unwanted in all my life as I did in those first few weeks and months as United States Senator.
And that second clip was Hubert Humphrey reflecting on what it was like coming to Washington in 1949 after his big speech in the 48 convention. Juan Williams, welcome to our conversation.
Be with you.
How important in the history of civil rights in this country was Hubert Humphrey?
Well, that 48 speech was truly a landmark. That's the moment at which you see organized politics get behind what we think of as the modern 20th century civil rights movement. That's the moment at which the Democratic Party sheds so much of its the paralysis engendered by being reliant on the Dixiecrats, the Southern Democrats. And remember, in that period, Democrats dominated the South politically. And it's at that point that you see someone rise up in the Democratic Party in the form of this very public convention. Remember, Hubert Humphrey's voice is heard nationwide as Speaker, the mayor of Minneapolis, at the convention. And here he is saying to people across the land via the medium of the day radio that this is an abomination. This is not what the Democratic Party, not what the American people should be standing for. He's speaking in terms of national morality and a call to justice, and he does it at a cost because you have the segregationists, the Dixiecrats, many of whom are leaders in the U.S. Senate and Congress, walk out of the convention. Of course, then it leads to third parties and all the rest. It has a tremendous consequence that will fall like dominoes throughout American history.
Name some of the names of the Dixiecrats who walked out of the convention.
Well, you have Senator Eastland. You know, I'm trying to think of some of the Thurman would be the big one. But you have Eastland and some of the other governors and members of the Senate who are right there.
Now, question, how risky was it for Hubert Humphrey, Senate candidate, to put his neck out on the line for civil rights? Was it controversial here at home?
You're talking about now after he's become senator.
No, no. In '48 when he was running, so he was a candidate, wasn't he that year?
He was, but he was still mayor, but he was a candidate.
But he was a candidate.
Right.
So here, among the voters in Minnesota, to speak out for civil rights, was that considered?
He came back as a hero here. So yeah, he was. I don't think it resonated here fine. Other parts of the country, it was a real problem.
And did he offer any risk for Harry Truman in making this?
Absolutely.
And how did Truman feel about this?
When he first started the speech, Truman called him a pipsqueak and was really upset about it. He thought he had ruined the election for him, and he was really upset about the fact that Humphrey was speaking. And Truman was watching it on an early TV in the White House, and he condemned him for it. But he learned later on that it actually helped him, and he turned it around and used his speech to get the African American vote in the North, and that helped him win.
And what, for either of you, inflamed his commitment to civil rights? Where did this come from in him?
That's a good question. Nobody knows. His father, he got it from his father, but the question is, where did his father get it in the middle of South Dakota? His father just raised him to believe that people are people, and they had their own form of colorblindness. It was quite remarkable. I mean, there were no African Americans in the small town he was in. There was one Catholic family, one Jewish family, who both had crosses burned on their lawns. So, you know, it was inside him. It was innate. So I don't know what no one can really come up with a reason, but it certainly was there.
Let's go to another call. This one's from Andrew, watching us in Newburgh, New York. Andrew, you're on. Welcome.
Hi. Good evening. How you doing?
Great. Thanks. Your question?
I was hoping that you could comment a little bit on the relationship between Senator Robert Kennedy and Hubert Humphrey, and how it developed from being political enemies in 1960 to 1968 when they were, vying for the Democrat presidential nomination.
Okay. RFK relationship.
The RFK relationship started really in 1960. He didn't really have much of a relationship with him before that. And it didn't start off well because of the way Humphrey was treated in the primaries by the Kennedys. And but he learned to like Robert Kennedy. They learned to be friends. He campaigned for Kennedy in '66 when he ran for the Senate. And in 1968, they had a meeting in May in early 1968, the Kennedy and Humphrey people. And they agreed that if Humphrey got the nomination, Kennedy would support him, and if Kennedy got the nomination, Humphrey would support him. So he was pretty much a inline Democrat. He was a party person, Bobby Kennedy, and so was Humphrey. So.
Next up is Ron in Everett, Washington. Welcome to the Humphrey discussion, Ron.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to jump back forward to the 1968 campaign again. Can you elaborate? It's my recollection that President Johnson actually in some ways tried to scuttle Humphrey's effort. And of course that was one of the closest popular elections in history. And for example, it's my recollection that if the bombing pause had been started a bit earlier, say a month earlier, that it might have made the crucial difference. Could you elaborate on that? Thanks.
Did Lyndon Johnson try to scuttle his bid for the White House?
Well, he never helped him. He didn't help him very much till the very end. And he did these kind of things where he had Nixon at the ranch, and then the next day he would have Humphrey at the ranch, and he'd bring all the press out for Nixon, and he would tell Humphrey no press could be there. So he did some really, and part of the belief is, among historians, is that Johnson believed that Humphrey might end the war and make him look bad, his legacy, and Nixon, he thought, might continue the war, and he might have very well been for Nixon until late in the campaign when Nixon played a few dirty tricks, and then he came out for Humphrey at that point. And he thought he might lose Texas at the end, which really didn't want to do. So he was really late in the campaign when he started working for Humphrey. But pretty much during the whole campaign, he was out of the picture. He really wasn't helping at all, and held Vietnam over him during the whole time.
Juan, I want to bring the story back to civil rights. So from the 1948 entry of Hubert Humphrey, and he built his campaign on this, the denouement really came in the early 1960s, 63 and 64, when civil rights legislation was being put forward. Tell that story, if you would, briefly.
Well, Humphrey's involvement is as the Democratic whip in the Senate. And you've got LBJ as president trying to, basically the inheritor of President Kennedy's mantle, President Kennedy's efforts to get civil rights legislation passed. But Kennedy, there was some doubt about his commitment to this, what he was willing to, the price, was he willing to pay the price in terms of the Southerners who would oppose it. But after the Kennedy assassination, Johnson expressed his sort of a recommitment to get this done in honor to President Kennedy.
And does he make Humphrey the point man on this?
Humphrey becomes the point man in the Senate. Mike Mansfield is the Senate Majority Leader, a Democrat, but it's Hubert Humphrey, the man who gave the 48 speech, the man who has been persistent in terms of calling for civil rights and justice as part of the Democratic agenda, who really takes up the cause in the Senate. And he's up against it because the rules were different then. You could filibuster to no end, and basically, I believe the numbers are like something like 67 votes were required in order to end the filibuster. And if you look through history, there are very few points at which you get enough votes to end a filibuster, but certainly it's exceptional that you would get enough votes to end a filibuster on any piece of civil rights legislation. That's almost unheard of. And it takes a great deal of effort by Hubert Humphrey to hold off a Republican effort to just prolong this filibuster, and finally he's able to do it. I think he only gets something like 4 votes in excess of the 67 that are needed in order to call an end to it. And then, of course, what's interesting is, the legislation couldn't even be put through the normal channels, because if it had been put through the Judiciary Committee, you would have run into none other than Senator Eastland. So it's kind of extra judicial process being put in place by Mansfield, but then engineered by Hubert Humphrey, and then the bill gets its overwhelming passage.
What were the opponents to civil rights constitutional arguments?
Well, the constitutional argument was largely states' rights, that we have a right to run our businesses. For instance, in a public place, we have a right to allow whoever we want in. That the Constitution allows us to do that. Well, of course, that was one of the main arguments. But there were a number of them. But I wanted to say too that the Dixiecrats were really probably the biggest obstacle for him. He had a number of Republicans that were on his side. In fact, it was a coalition of Republicans and Democrats that made it happen, because they had the Dixiecrats in the Democratic Party, and those people were just, there was no way you're going to change any of their minds. So it was an interesting group. Thomas Kuchel was the Republican on the Republican side, and Everett Dirksen eventually. So the opposition was real conservative Republicans. Like Barry Goldwater was against the Civil Rights Bill, for instance, and the Dixiecrats. That was his obstacle.
And
to get it passed.
The drama of this filibuster coming down to the wire. We're going to, just to give you a sense of what the arguments were like at the time, we have another clip. And this is Hubert Humphrey and Strom Thurmond debating the 64 Civil Rights Bill. It's a back-to-back clip, again with Hubert Humphrey talking in a speech about his strategy. So 2 clips back-to-back. Let's watch that debate from 64, and then we'll come back to our 2 guests.
And we know that fellow Americans who happen to be Negro have been denied equal access to places of public accommodation, denied in their travels the chance for a place to rest and to eat.
It's not public accommodations, it's invasion of private property. This will lead to integration of private life.
In the city of Birmingham, Alabama, up to 1963, there was an ordinance that said that if you were going to have a restaurant
and you were going to permit a Negro to come in, you had to have a 7-foot wall down the middle of the restaurant dividing the white from the colored. Now, how foolish this is, and isn't that an invasion of private property? Senator, we live in a country of freedom, and under our Constitution, a man has a right to use his own private property as he sees fit. We must remember that this bill creates no jobs. So therefore, whose jobs are these Negroes, the minority, going to take? Other Negroes' jobs or white people's jobs?
Everyone has this weighing heavily on our conscience. And we must, as individual citizens, speak out against prejudice and bigotry and discrimination. And we must be willing to accept the fact that every American is entitled to equal rights under the Constitution and under the law. No less than that. Well, the most difficult task that I have as the floor leader on the Civil Rights Bill is just being there, having to watch every move and make sure that at all times we have present or readily available 51 senators, because one of the tactics of the opposition is to call for repeated quorums, which means that we have to produce 51 senators to answer the role.
That story of needing at that time with the Senate rules different, always to have 51 supporters of the legislation on the floor. So how did he organize the people to be there?
Oh, he had teams, and they would rotate. And at times when if they didn't get a quorum, the Senate would be shut down. It would work in the favor of the anti-civil rights people. And they were able to bring only 2 or 3 people in and leave them there. They'd go home and 2 or 3 people more come in, and they had this rotating basis. And they would wear out the 51 people that had to be there. So they did things like drive to baseball games and pull a senator out of the baseball game, bring him back to the Senate, and when they had to get a quorum, and they did all kinds of things. And they had people, they had a list, and they had a schedule for senators that had to be in. I mean, it was really well done, but they had some moments when it didn't work. I mean, they had to get people from outside the Senate and bring them back, fly them back and things to get a quorum.
Was the opposition largely regional? Was it the Southern Coalition that opposed civil rights, or was it broader than that?
Well, you had Humphrey, for example. I'm sorry, you had Goldwater, for example, who's a Westerner and from Arizona. And his opposition was sort of libertarian, which picks up on what Mick was just saying, which is that, you know, this is a free country, it's a matter of private property. You shouldn't be telling a man what to do. And you see much of this then get reflected in Strom Thurmond's language. I think we just saw some of that. But Thurmond is not speaking just in terms of sort of rank racism, but he's saying this is a violation of my rights as an American to make personal choices and a violation of personal freedom. And Humphrey's having to come back and say, this is ridiculous, this is not a genuine argument. In fact, what you're doing is perpetrating the worst kind of racism, and you're oppressing people, and that becomes the argument. It's interesting to go back, I mean, just to listen to that clip, and you know, we have such arguments today about jobs in our country and what's necessary to be done, and here you can hear Strom Thurmond saying, oh, well, this legislation doesn't produce jobs, and therefore blacks, or as he says, Negroes, are going to take the white man's job. You just think, oh my God. But clearly he was comfortable saying this, and it had some effect in that era. You know, it's not as if he was speaking into a void. To the contrary, it was generating a political response and strong opposition to the civil rights legislation.
Let's take a call from Jimmy in Williamson, West Virginia. You're on, Jimmy.
I'm so glad you called me, ma'am. This is wonderful. I haven't spoken, but to one of the sons of Senator Humphrey, in the last, well, since he died, over the years, I think I spoke with Skip. I am Jimmy Wolford. I'm the fellow who sang the Hubert Humphrey songs. I have such a wonderful love for him. Over the years, he took me everywhere. I sang everything. He taught me politics. He had great respect for me because I came from a family who, my father worked the railroad and my grandpa, the McCoys, worked coal mines. And Hubert Humphrey came back in here. He heard me sing on a radio station in Williamson, West Virginia in 1960. He gave me $25 a day to travel with him. And Teddy White wrote a book called The Making of the President. And Teddy became one of my best friends. And Teddy taught me a lot, and everyone in Minnesota that I've met and throughout America, and the great of people that I met, the Henry Fondas and the presidents and the vice presidents and the people all over this country. I'm 77 years old now, and I still record. I did record for Capitol Records for years, and I'm doing material now in the stories of the Hatfields and McCoys, my mama's family. Hubert Humphrey was, to me, like my father.
Jimmy, thank you so much for that personal story. You know of Jimmy Wofford's songs about?
Yeah. I'm not going to sing them, but I know them. Yeah, I know them. He was, and he's traveled with them all the time. He was with them very closely, and it's good to hear his voice. And he's one person I had lost in this whole search for interviews. I didn't know where he was, so I'm glad he's alive and well.
77 years old. Thanks for calling in and adding that personal touch. We got to get one more relationship established here, which was over the course of his civil rights career and around the passage of the bill. Did he develop a personal friendship with Martin Luther King?
Well, he certainly knew King very well, and he had a relationship with King around this legislation, because it's interesting that if you look inside the reaction in the black community, I mean, remember, there are lots of people who are militants who don't see the value of this legislation. King, on the other hand, is saying, no, this is a necessary step. If you go back to the Great March on Washington '63, in large measure it says it's for jobs, freedom, etc., but in large measure it's to say to the United States Congress, pass the Civil Rights Act, pass the law, put it in place. And Humphrey is one of the great supporters of this at the time. He is at the March on Washington. He is someone who is emphatic in his support, even as you get people in the Dixiecrats saying, oh no, we shouldn't have a March on Washington. They're just trying to pressure us politically and all the fears that surround it. Humphrey was a total supporter and thought that it was a good and necessary step.
One other thing about he and Martin Luther King, at the early stages of the filibuster, he met with Martin Luther King, and he said to him, I want you to know that we're on the same page, and if I say some things to these Dixiecrats, because Humphrey's policy was to treat them with respect and try to go through it, use the Humphrey way rather than the Johnson way, which was negotiate. If I say some things to them in public that you don't like, remember, I'm just saying this because I want the bill to get passed and we're on the same page, and don't get upset about it. So he had this great meeting with him before.
So we can hardly do justice to Hubert Humphrey's career before he ran for president himself in 1968, but at least you get some sense of his work on the national stage in civil rights that he took into the vice presidency, and then in 1968 when he decided to run for president himself. We didn't establish this, but very important, that Lyndon Johnson made the decision early in 1968 that he would not seek the office, thus setting the stage. At that point, how many Democratic contenders were thinking about challenging Lyndon Johnson?
Well, it was basically Bobby Kennedy and Gene McCarthy.
And they were anti-war candidates?
Yes, they were both anti-war candidates. And then Humphrey, it was April 27th, about a little less than a month later that Humphrey joined the...
When did Johnson announce?
29th of March.
And was that a surprise to the nation?
It was a shock, Danny. It was a shock to Humphrey, and he had shown up at Humphrey's apartment earlier that day. Humphrey was in Mexico before he left town, before he left Washington. He showed up at Humphrey's apartment and said, I'm going to give this speech. I've got two endings. I'm not going to tell you which one. I'm not even going to read them to you, but you should listen to the speech because you'll be surprised at one of the endings if I use it. He hadn't decided yet. So Humphrey was in Mexico, and he was called out to watch this broadcast, and he announced that he was leaving the office. And because of the chaos that was going on there, they thought that they heard that he was immediately leaving office, which would have made Humphrey president. And so there was all this, commotion, and then they realized that he was leaving at the end of his term. But it was a complete shock to him and to the country.
You know what's interesting about this to me is that, Susan, as you ask about who's running against him, it really was Gene McCarthy. And Gene McCarthy is the one who's in New Hampshire and taking on Johnson. Johnson's not actively campaigning, but clearly he has surrogates and people who are all around who stand for Johnson and for the kind of Democratic Party establishment of the time. Gene McCarthy is the anti-establishment, anti-Johnson candidate, and he has support from, people who are superstars of the era. I mean, today we still know Barbra Streisand or Burt Lancaster, but they're all people who are anti-Vietnam War, and of course all the college students are just emphatic about Gene McCarthy. And Gene McCarthy does surprisingly well in New Hampshire and legitimized the idea that Johnson is vulnerable. And it's only after McCarthy's success that then you start to see Robert Kennedy willing to jump in. And then people are, questioning why is he jumping and trying to block Gene McCarthy because they think McCarthy has the momentum. And then, of course, that sets the table. But even as Hubert Humphrey's thinking that he, too, is trying to pull back on the war, he is pressured by the fact that he's loyal to the man who gave him the vice presidency, Lyndon Johnson. It's one of these, to me, wonderful political stories where you see someone saying, you know what, you can tell Hubert Humphrey's really a good guy, and he's not going to put Lyndon Johnson in a position where Lyndon Johnson feels that he's being undercut by his number two, the guy that he empowered. But at the same time, and as you and Mick have discussed earlier, Johnson is just totally dismissive of Humphrey, and especially Humphrey's contribution or desire to make a contribution, saying, you know what, this war is not the right war.
Let's get to another call. This is Larry in Sherman Oaks, California. Hi, Larry.
Hi. I'm a rather big fan of Humphrey's, and for many years it took me quite a while to accept the fact that he was never going to be president, even after his passing. So I was able to finally channel that energy into putting up my own Humphrey website, which I've had since 2002. And in 1998, I visited MHS along with the Humphrey Institute when Steve Sandell was there. We looked in the catalogs, didn't see any items surrounding the Middle East War in June. I would have thought Humphrey would have made some speeches or interviews or something. Didn't see anything, and that surprised me.
What was he involved in Middle East policy, and did he speak out on it?
He was, but I don't think, they were talking about June of '68, I guess is what they're talking about. I don't think that was at the forefront right at that point. He had just too much else on his plate, I think, is what it probably was. I don't remember ever seeing anything either, and I've been through all of his archives. So.
With the early primaries and Lyndon Johnson's announcement, things start going into warp speed in 1968. It was a year of assassinations, the first being Martin Luther King's. What happened in the country with the King assassination?
Well, it's hard to summarize it, but let me just say that you immediately have riots. You have riots that are still mark cities like Washington, D.C., Chicago, Kansas City. It becomes a national moment of crisis, and you have people fearful that there's going to be large-scale racial war in the country after this assassination. It's the unrest that surrounded the Vietnam War is still present, but now it becomes a background, because remember, King was an opponent of the Vietnam War. And he had said that this was an unjust war and a wrong war, and why are black and white boys dying in this war? And there were people who were trying to join the civil rights movement with the anti-war movement. And King, who has not been political, King, who had condemned, said, there were flaws within the Democratic Party and flaws within the Republican Party, is becoming more political. And there are people inside the civil rights movement who recognize that Johnson has been so supportive in terms of civil rights, and Humphrey supported it. Why are you, Dr. King, now challenging this administration that's been so supportive of us? But King, nonetheless, says that he feels a moral imperative. Remember, he's a Nobel Peace Prize winner, and he feels a moral imperative to say that this is part of an injustice that's being perpetrated by America, that America is on the wrong side of world history in pursuing this war effort. You got 500,000 Americans at war, record numbers of deaths, and he is out there speaking against it. A year before he's assassinated, he's at the Riverside Church in New York, making a speech that gets lots of attention. Shortly before he's assassinated, he's at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., speaking against the war. And so it becomes part of the energy that surrounds him, and it puts him in the position of being an opponent of the Johnson administration.
Syracuse, New York, this is Ralph. You're on the air.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the Contenders. I'm a proud UAW worker from upstate New York, and I have a quick comment and a quick question, and I'll hang up. But I have a video at home from the AFL-CIO, and the title of it is Words of a True Friend of Workers and Their Unions, and it was about Hubert Humphrey, and he was speaking at an AFL-CIO gathering. And it was towards the end of his life, and he's still smiling. He knew it was almost at the end. And he had a great quote at the end of his speech. He says, I'd rather live 50 years like a tiger than 100 years like a chicken, but I want to move up to 1968. And I met a guy about 20 years ago who said he worked on the Humphrey campaign in 1968. And he said that he came home after working on the campaign, and he was at this hotel, and he was looking out. At this park, and the news came on, and said that there's Humphrey protesters having violence in the park. And he called Humphrey the next day when they had a meeting, and Humphrey says, I know Nixon's been doing it for a while, and there's nothing we can do about it. But I think Nixon, from this guy's story, Nixon was doing it to try to link Humphrey to anti-war protesters. And I was wondering if your guests have ever heard a story like this, and thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Well, I have heard stories of being paid protesters, and I've heard that in the civil rights movement too, I believe, where people were paid to cause trouble. And but you know, there's never been. It's hard to document, but you know, there were stories about it, and I'm sure it probably happened at times. But that's, you know, there's no way to know for sure.
He was a union caller. How important were the labor unions to the civil rights effort and the anti-war movement?
Oh, well, on the civil rights front, they were very important. It's funny, they were slow to come along. You think of A. Philip Randolph going all the way back to the 20s and 30s, trying to get the labor movement in this country to understand the importance